Picture this. It's 40,000 years ago. The sun is setting over a vast European landscape that looks nothing like the world you know. Massive glaciers stretch across continents. Woolly mammoths thunder across frozen plains. And in a cave carved into limestone cliffs, a small group of humans huddles around a flickering fire. But these aren't the grunting, club-wielding brutes you've seen in cartoons. The woman tending the fire has nimble fingers that can craft tools more precise than a surgeon's scalpel. The man painting on the cave wall possesses an artistic vision that would make Picasso weep. The child playing with carved bone toys is developing a brain more complex than any computer we've ever built. This is the real story of our ancestors, not the Hollywood version, but the truth revealed by decades of archaeological discovery and scientific research. A story of survival against impossible odds, of innovation born from necessity, of the first stirrings of art, religion, and human consciousness. For over 200,000 years, our species lived as hunter-gatherers. That's 95% of human history, a vast expanse of time when every day was a battle for survival. Yet also when the foundations of everything we call human were laid. Come with us on a journey back to the dawn of humanity. We'll walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, see through their eyes, feel their fears and triumphs. We'll discover how they survived ice ages and volcanic winters, how they developed language and art, how they loved and mourned and dreamed. This isn't just ancient history, it's your history. The DNA flowing through your veins carries the memories of these ancient struggles. The way you think, the way you love, the way you fear, all of it was shaped in the caves and campsites of our prehistoric past. So let's begin at the beginning. When humanity took its first tentative steps out of Africa and into a world that would test every fiber of our being. The story begins in the heart of Africa. In the Rift Valley, where tectonic forces have torn the earth apart, creating a landscape of lakes, volcanoes, and endless savanna. Here, sometime around 200,000 years ago, a new species emerged from the evolutionary crucible, Homo sapiens. Us. But these early humans were not alone. The world was crowded with our cousins Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Homo erectus scattered across the old world. Our ancestors were just one species among many, and by no means the most successful. For over 100,000 years, our species remained trapped in Africa, hemmed in by deserts, oceans, and perhaps most importantly, by their own limitations. They had fire, they had simple tools, but they lacked something crucial, the spark of behavioral modernity that would eventually make them masters of the planet. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Perhaps it was a genetic mutation that enhanced cognitive ability. Perhaps it was the development of complex language. Perhaps it was simply the pressure of a volcanic winter that forced innovation or extinction. Mount Toba, a supervolcano in Indonesia, erupted with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs. Ash clouds blocked the sun for years. Global temperatures plummeted. The human population crashed to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals, a genetic bottleneck so severe that all of humanity today descends from this tiny group of survivors. But from this near extinction came transformation. The humans who survived Toba were different, more innovative, more adaptable, more capable of complex thought and planning. And they were ready to leave Africa behind. The first wave of migration followed the coastlines, island hopping across the Red Sea when sea levels were lower. These maritime pioneers possessed sophisticated knowledge of tides, currents, and seasonal patterns. They could build rafts and navigate by the star, skills that would have been impossible without complex language and cultural transmission. By 65,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, a journey that required crossing at least 60 miles of open ocean. Think about that for a moment. These supposed primitive people were accomplished sailors, capable of planning and executing voyages that would challenge modern adventurers. But the real challenge lay ahead, the colonization of Europe and Northern Asia. Lands locked in the grip of an ice age that would test human ingenuity to its very limits. Around 45,000 years ago, small bands of humans began pushing into Europe. They found a landscape dominated by glaciers, where winter temperatures could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and summer was a brief respite from the cold. This was a world of mammoth steppes, where vast herds of megafauna roamed beneath aurora-lit skies, and they found they were not alone. The Neanderthals had been living in Europe for 400,000 years. They were perfectly adapted to the cold, stocky, muscular, with large brains and sophisticated tool technologies. They were the established residents, and the newcomers from Africa were the invaders. What happened next would determine the future of our species. Would the newcomers be absorbed into Neanderthal populations? Would they be driven back to Africa? Or would they find a way to not just survive, but thrive in this frozen world? The answer lay in their ability to innovate, to adapt, and to work together in ways that no human species had ever done before. Imagine the scene: a small band of modern humans, perhaps 20 individuals, crests a ridge in what is now southern France. Below them stretches a valley where smoke rises from a Neanderthal camp. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, two species of humans are about to meet face to face. The Neanderthals they encountered were not the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. These were sophisticated people with complex cultures. They buried their dead with flowers and grave goods. They created art cave paintings and carved symbols that show abstract thinking. They had language, though perhaps not as complex as that of the newcomers. Most importantly, they were perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. Their stocky bodies conserved heat efficiently. Their large noses warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. Their powerful muscles could drive spears through mammoth hide. They had survived in this harsh environment for 15 times longer than modern humans have existed as a species. The Neanderthals were master tool makers. Their Mousterian technology produced sharp, efficient implements from carefully prepared stone cores. They could start fires in any weather, construct sophisticated shelters, and hunt the largest animals on Earth. By any measure, they should have dominated the newcomers, but the modern humans brought something new: behavioral flexibility that allowed them to adapt and innovate at an unprecedented pace. Where Neanderthals had perfected their technology over hundreds of thousands of years, modern humans could develop new solutions within generations. The archaeological record shows a sudden explosion of innovation wherever modern humans appeared. Blade technology that produced razor-sharp cutting edges. Bone and antler tools that were lighter and more versatile than stone. Composite tools that combined multiple materials for maximum efficiency. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans brought art and symbolic thinking to a new level. They created the first musical instruments, bone flutes that could play complex melodies. They carved figurines that may represent the world's first. Religious art. They developed body painting and personal ornamentation that marked individual and group identity. This wasn't just decoration, it was communication. These symbols allowed modern humans to share complex information across time and space. A carved symbol could convey the location of game animals, the timing of seasonal migrations, or the spiritual significance of a particular place. The two species coexisted for about 15,000 years, long enough for significant interaction. DNA evidence shows that they interbred, with most modern humans carrying 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. But gradually, inexorably, the Neanderthals began to disappear. The last known Neanderthal population survived in southern Spain until about 28,000 years ago. Then they were gone, leaving only their genes in our DNA and their tools in archaeological sites. The exact cause of their extinction remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Asterisk, did modern humans actively compete with them for resources? Did climate change favor the more adaptable newcomers? Did diseases carried by modern humans devastate Neanderthal populations that had no immunity? Or was it simply that modern humans' superior communication and cooperation gave them a slight but decisive advantage? Whatever the cause, by 30,000 years ago, modern humans were the sole survivors of the human family tree in Europe. They had inherited a continent, but they would need every ounce of their ingenuity to survive what was coming next. The last glacial maximum was approaching, the deepest freeze of the Ice Age, when glaciers would cover a third of the planet and survival would become humanity's greatest challenge. 25,000 years ago, the world was a frozen wasteland that would be barely recognizable today. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered most of Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Russia. Sea levels had dropped 400 feet, exposing vast continental shelves. The English Channel was a river valley, and you could walk from Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, God in this world. Summer temperatures in Central Europe rarely rose above freezing. Winter brought blizzards that could last for weeks. With temperatures dropping to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, this was the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age, and it would test human survival skills to their absolute limits. Yet somehow, our ancestors not only survived, but thrived. They developed technologies and social systems that allowed them to live comfortably in conditions that would kill an unprepared. Modern human within hours, their homes were marvels of engineering adapted to extreme cold. In Ukraine and Russia, they built houses from mammoth bones, massive structures that could house 20 or more people. The walls were made from mammoth skulls and leg bones, chinked with smaller bones, and covered with mammoth hide. The roofs were supported by curved mammoth tusks and insulated with layers of fur and vegetation. These weren't crude shelters. They were sophisticated dwellings with multiple rooms, storage areas, and central hearths designed to maximize heat retention. Some had elaborate entrance tunnels that prevented cold air from entering the living spaces. Archaeological evidence suggests they were warm enough inside that people could work comfortably in light clothing, even when it was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Their clothing was equally sophisticated. They developed tailored garments that fit closely to the body, preventing heat loss while allowing freedom of movement. They used sinew thread and bone needles to create waterproof seams. They layered different types of fur for maximum insulation: soft fur next to the skin, dense fur for the middle layer, and water-resistant fur on the outside. They invented the world's first winter boots, complex constructions of multiple layers of fur and leather, sometimes with bone or antler cleats for traction on ice. They created snow goggles from bone or antler with narrow slits to prevent snow blindness. They developed specialized tools for every aspect of Arctic survival, but perhaps their greatest achievement was learning to hunt the giants of the Ice Age. Woolly mammoths stood 11 feet tall and weighed 6 tons. Woolly rhinoceros were even more dangerous, with massive horns and aggressive temperaments. Cave bears were larger than modern grizzlies and had no fear of humans. Hunting these creatures required unprecedented cooperation and planning. A mammoth hunt might involve dozens of people working together over several days. They would study the animal's behavior, identify migration routes, and construct elaborate traps and drive lanes. Some sites show evidence of mammoth drives where entire herds were stampeded over cliffs or into bogs. Others reveal sophisticated spear traps with weighted points designed to penetrate thick mammoth hide. The famous Clovis points of North America could punch through a mammoth skull with enough force. A single mammoth could feed a band of 25 people for months. The meat was preserved by freezing or smoking. The fat was rendered for fuel and waterproofing. The bones became tools and building materials. The hide provided clothing and shelter. Nothing was wasted, but survival required more than just hunting prowess. It demanded unprecedented social cooperation. Ice Age bands developed complex sharing networks that could span hundreds of miles. If one group had a successful hunt, they would share with neighboring bands, knowing that the favor would be returned. When their own luck ran out, these weren't simple acts of charity. They were sophisticated insurance systems that allowed human populations to survive in environments where individual failure meant death. They developed elaborate gift exchange networks, seasonal gathering places, and complex kinship systems that bound communities together across vast distances. They also developed rich oral traditions that preserved crucial survival information. Stories about animal behavior, weather patterns, and resource locations were passed down through generations in the form of myths and legends. These weren't just entertainment, they were survival manuals encoded in memorable narratives. And in the depths of caves, by the light of flickering torches, they created some of humanity's first great art. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira weren't primitive scrawls, they were sophisticated, artistic achievements that revealed deep understanding of animal anatomy, movement, and behavior. These artists mixed pigments with sophisticated understanding of chemistry. They used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They painted by torchlight in chambers so deep underground that they had to crawl through narrow passages to reach them. Why did they do it? What drove these survival-focused people to spend precious time and resources creating art in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of caves? The answer reveals something profound about human nature, even in the harshest conditions. Our ancestors felt compelled to create beauty, to express meaning, to leave something behind that said, "We were here." But the Ice Age couldn't last forever. Around 15,000 years ago, the climate began to warm. The great ice sheets started their slow retreat, and humanity faced a new challenge adapting to a rapidly changing world, where the survival strategies that had worked for millennia were suddenly obsolete. The megafauna that had sustained Ice Age peoples began to disappear. Mammoths, giant bison, cave bears, one by one, they vanished from the landscape. Our ancestors would need to develop entirely new ways of life, or face extinction themselves. It was time for the greatest transformation in human history. Dawn breaks over a Paleolithic campsite in what is now southern France. 20,000 years ago, the first rays of sunlight filter through the smoke rising from carefully banked fires. In a world without alarm clocks, calendars, or schedules, people wake with the rhythm of the natural world, but their day will be anything but simple. Let's follow Kira, a 25-year-old woman who is considered middle-aged in this harsh world where few people live past 40. She's already been awake for an hour, nursing her infant daughter while mentally planning the day's activities. In her mind, she carries a detailed map of the surrounding territory, every water source, every seasonal food location, every potential danger. Kira's knowledge would astound a modern person. She can identify over 200 different plants and their uses, which ones are edible at what times of year, which have medicinal properties, which can be used for tools or shelter. She knows the behavior patterns of dozens of animal species, the meaning of different bird calls, the significance of subtle changes in wind direction. Her first task is gathering the activity that provides 60 to 80% of the band's calories. This isn't casual berry picking. It's a sophisticated science requiring deep knowledge of ecology, seasonality, and processing techniques. She knows that acorns need to be leached of tannins before eating, that certain roots are only nutritious after the first frost, that some plants are toxic unless prepared correctly. Modern hunter-gatherer studies show that women, like Kira, typically know the locations of thousands of individual plants across territories, spanning hundreds of square miles. They can navigate by landmarks, star positions, and subtle environmental cues with accuracy that rivals GPS systems. Kira's 8-year-old son, Tor, accompanies her, learning through observation and participation. There are no schools in the Paleolithic, but education is constant and comprehensive. By age 12, Tor will know more about survival in his environment than most modern people know about their own neighborhoods. He's learning to read tracks, not just what animal made them, but how long ago, whether the animal was healthy or injured, whether it was running or walking, whether it was alone or part of a group. He's learning to identify edible insects, to predict weather patterns, to understand the complex relationships between different species. Meanwhile, Kira's partner Bren is working on tools with several other men. Toolmaking in the Paleolithic was a high art requiring years of training and exceptional skill. A master knapper could produce a razor-sharp blade thinner than paper from a piece of flint, using techniques that modern archaeologists struggle to replicate. These weren't crude implements. Paleolithic tools were often more efficient than their modern equivalents. A properly made stone knife could be sharper than surgical steel. A well-crafted spear point could penetrate armor. The compound tools they created, spear throwers, harpoons, needles, required sophisticated understanding of physics and engineering. Asterisk. Bren is preparing for a hunting expedition that might last several days. This requires careful planning and coordination. The hunters must consider wind direction, animal migration patterns, the phase of the moon, and dozens of other variables. They're not just chasing animals randomly, they're executing complex strategies based on detailed knowledge of animal behavior. They use persistence hunting running prey, animals to exhaustion over long distances. Humans are among the best endurance runners in the animal kingdom, capable of maintaining a steady pace for hours, while most prey animals can only sprint in short bursts. It's a technique that requires exceptional physical fitness and intimate knowledge of the landscape, but hunting is dangerous. A wounded mammoth or bison can easily kill a human. Cave bears and cave lions see humans as prey. Even smaller animals can inflict fatal injuries. The hunters carry not just weapons, but sophisticated first aid knowledge, how to stop bleeding, set bones, treat infections with plant medicines. Back at camp, the afternoon brings social activities that are crucial for group survival. This is when knowledge is shared, disputes are resolved, and social bonds are strengthened. Storytelling isn't just entertainment, it's how crucial information is preserved and transmitted. An elder might tell a story about the winter when the mammoths changed their migration route, encoding vital survival information in a memorable narrative. A successful hunter might demonstrate a new technique, spreading innovation through the group. Young people might practice skills through games that prepare them for adult. Responsibilities. Music and dance play important roles in Paleolithic society. They strengthen group bonds, coordinate collective activities, and may serve spiritual functions. The bone flutes found in archaeological sites could play complex melodies, suggesting sophisticated musical traditions. Religion in the Paleolithic was likely animistic, seeing spirits in animals, plants, and natural features. Burial practices show belief in an afterlife, with bodies carefully positioned and accompanied by tools, ornaments, and food for the journey ahead. As darkness falls, the band gathers around the fire. This is the most dangerous time when predators are active and humans are most vulnerable. The fire provides not just light and warmth, but protection from the creatures that hunt in the darkness. Cave lions, cave bears, and hyenas were all larger and more dangerous than their modern relatives. Saber-toothed cats could kill a human with a single bite. The fire and the group's vigilance are all that stand between the band and death. But the evening is also a time for intimacy and reflection. Couples share quiet moments while children sleep. Elders pass on knowledge to younger generations. Artists work on carvings or paintings by firelight. Sleep comes early and is often interrupted. People sleep in shifts, with someone always awake to tend the fire and watch for danger. Dreams might be seen as messages from the spirit world, influencing the next day's decisions. This is the rhythm of Paleolithic life, a constant balance between survival and humanity, between practical necessity and spiritual meaning. Every day brings new challenges, but also new opportunities to strengthen the bonds that hold the group together. It's a life that would seem impossibly hard to modern people. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that hunter-gatherers were generally healthier, had more leisure time, and lived with less stress than early agricultural peoples. They were the ultimate specialists, perfectly adapted to their environment and their way of life. But this ancient way of life was about to face its greatest challenge, not from ice or predators, but from humanity's own success. In a cave in what is now Israel, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary: the 100,000-year-old burial of a Neanderthal child, carefully laid to rest with flowers and stone tools. This simple grave tells us something profound. The capacity for love, grief, and hope for an afterlife isn't uniquely modern. It's been part of the human experience for hundreds of thousands of years. Let's explore the emotional landscape of our ancestors, how they loved, how they raised their children, how they faced the universal experiences of birth, coming of age, and death that unite all humanity across time. Paleolithic families were small but intensely bonded. A typical band might include 20 to 30 people, several nuclear families related by blood or marriage. Children grew up with multiple parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, all taking responsibility for their care and education. Childhood in the Paleolithic was both harsh and nurturing. Infant mortality was high, perhaps 40% of children died before age 5, but those who survived received intensive care and attention. Mothers nursed their children for 3 to 4 years, providing not just nutrition, but crucial antibodies and emotional bonding. Archaeological evidence shows that Paleolithic people cared for disabled members of their communities. Skeletons show individuals who survived serious injuries or birth defects that would have made them unable to contribute to hunting or gathering. They were kept alive and cared for by their communities, evidence of compassion that goes back tens of thousands of years. Children learned through play and imitation. They had toys, carved animals, dolls, miniature tools that prepared them for adult life. But they also participated in real work from an early age. By 6 or 7, children were contributing to gathering activities. By 12, they were taking on adult responsibilities. Coming of age was marked by elaborate rituals that varied between cultures but shared common themes. Young people might undergo vision quests, endurance tests, or initiation ceremonies that marked their transition to adulthood. These weren't just symbolic, they were practical tests of the skills needed for survival. For girls, menarche was often celebrated as the beginning of their power to create life. For boys, the first successful hunt might be marked with special ceremonies and the right to wear adult ornaments or tattoos. These rituals bound young people to their communities and reinforced cultural values. Marriage in the Paleolithic was both practical and emotional. Partners needed to be compatible workers, as well as lovers' survival depended on cooperation between spouses. But evidence suggests that romantic love existed too. Couples were often buried together, and personal ornaments show individual preferences and gift-giving between partners. Pair bonding was strong, but not necessarily exclusive or permanent. Some evidence suggests that Paleolithic societies were more sexually egalitarian than later agricultural cultures. Women had important roles as gatherers, healers, and spiritual leaders. The famous Venus figurines found across Europe might represent goddess figures or simply celebrations of female fertility and power. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous but sacred events. Women gave birth with the assistance of experienced midwives who knew herbal medicines for pain relief and infection prevention. The survival of both mother and child was never guaranteed. making successful births occasions for celebration and spiritual gratitude. Newborns were welcomed into communities with naming ceremonies and protective rituals. They were carried constantly by their mothers or other caregivers, developing strong attachment bonds that lasted throughout life. The extended family structure meant that children had multiple role models and sources of support, but death was a constant presence in Paleolithic life. The average lifespan was perhaps 30 to 35 years, though those who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s. Death could come suddenly from accidents, predator attacks, or infections that modern medicine treats easily. Yet Paleolithic peoples developed sophisticated ways of dealing with grief and loss. Burial practices show deep respect for the dead and belief in continued existence after death. Bodies were often positioned facing east toward the rising sun, or curled in fetal positions suggesting rebirth. Grave goods, tools, ornaments, food suggest belief that the dead would need these items in the afterlife. Some burials show evidence of elaborate funeral feasts where the community gathered to honor the deceased and support the grieving family. The famous Shanidar cave burials in Iraq show Neanderthals burying their dead with flowers, hyacinths, bachelor's buttons, and other blooms that had no practical purpose except to honor the deceased. This 60,000-year-old gesture of love and respect shows that the human heart hasn't changed in all the millennia since. Elders held special status in Paleolithic societies. Their accumulated knowledge was invaluable for survival. They remembered rare events, unusual weather patterns, and the locations of emergency resources. They were the living libraries of their communities, and their deaths were profound losses. Asterisk, but elders also faced the reality of becoming burdens when they could no longer contribute to survival. Some evidence suggests that in extreme circumstances, elderly or sick individuals might choose to sacrifice themselves for the good of the group, walking into blizzards or refusing food during famines. These weren't cruel decisions, but acts of love and wisdom. In a world where the survival of the group was paramount, individual sacrifice for the greater good was seen as noble. Yet many elders were cared for long past their productive years, showing that compassion often trumped practicality. The emotional life of Paleolithic peoples was rich and complex. They experienced joy in successful hunts, pride in skilled craftsmanship, wonder at natural phenomena, and deep spiritual connections to the world around them. They laughed, they cried, they dreamed. They were fully human in every sense. Their art shows this emotional depth. The cave paintings aren't just records of animals. They're expressions of awe, fear, and spiritual connection. The carved figurines aren't just tools. They're attempts to capture beauty, fertility, and meaning in permanent form. When we look at Paleolithic art, tools, and burials, we're not seeing the products of primitive minds. We're seeing the work of people whose emotional and intellectual lives were as rich as our own. They face the same fundamental questions that we do: how to love, how to raise children, how to find meaning in the face of mortality. Their answers, forged in the crucible of survival, created the foundation of human culture that we still build upon today. Deep in the Chauvet cave in southern France, a torch flickers against limestone walls. The year is 32,000 BC, and an artist is putting the finishing touches on a masterpiece that will survive longer than any human civilization. With charcoal and ochre, using the natural contours of the rock, they create a gallery of animals so lifelike they seem to move in the dancing torchlight. This isn't primitive art. It's sophisticated visual storytelling that reveals minds capable of abstract thinking, symbolic representation, and aesthetic judgment. The Chauvet paintings show horses in motion, their manes flowing, lions stalking prey with muscles tensed, rhinoceros charging with such power you could almost hear their thundering hooves. But why did they do it? These weren't decorations for living spaces. The caves were deep, dangerous, and difficult to access. Creating art here required carrying torches through narrow passages, crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, and working in chambers where a single wrong step could mean death. The answer reveals something profound about human nature. Even in the harshest conditions imaginable, when every calorie and every moment was precious for survival, our ancestors felt compelled to create beauty. Art wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity of the human spirit. These Paleolithic artists were sophisticated technicians. They understood chemistry, mixing pigments with binders that would last for millennia. They used iron oxides for reds and yellows, manganese for blacks, and charcoal for deep, rich darkness. They discovered that mixing pigments with saliva or animal fat created paint that adhered better to cave walls. They were masters of perspective and proportion. The animals in cave painting show accurate anatomy and realistic movement. The artists understood how to use the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. A bulge in the rock becomes a bison's shoulder. A crack becomes a horse's mane. They developed multiple techniques: finger painting, brush painting with animal hair or plant fibers, blowpipe stenciling, and even spray painting by blowing pigment through hollow bones. Some paintings show evidence of scaffolding or ladders used to reach high cave walls. The famous hand stencils found in caves worldwide were created by placing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it. But analysis shows these weren't random decorations. They were signatures, territorial markers, or perhaps ritual elements in spiritual ceremonies. Art wasn't limited to painting. Paleolithic peoples created the world's first musical instruments, bone flutes that could play complex melodies, drums made from mammoth skulls, and rattles carved from antler. These instruments show sophisticated understanding of acoustics and musical theory. The flutes found in German caves are 40,000 years old, among the oldest known musical instruments. They were carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory with precise finger holes that create specific musical scales. Playing them requires the same breath control and finger dexterity as modern flutes. Sculpture was equally sophisticated. The famous Venus figurines found across Europe show remarkable artistic skill. These small carvings emphasize female fertility and sexuality. But they're not crude representations. They're stylized art that captures the essence of femininity in stone, bone, and ivory. Some scholars believe these figurines were goddess images. Others think they were self-portraits by women. And still others suggest they were teaching tools for midwifery. Whatever their purpose, they show that Paleolithic artists could work in three dimensions with remarkable skill. Personal ornamentation was another form of artistic expression. Paleolithic peoples created elaborate jewelry from shells, teeth, bones, and stones. They drilled tiny holes in delicate materials, carved intricate patterns, and created color combinations that show sophisticated, aesthetic sense. These ornaments weren't just decoration, they were communication. Different styles might indicate tribal affiliation, social status, spiritual beliefs, or personal achievements. A necklace of cave bear teeth might show a successful hunter. A carved ivory pendant might indicate a skilled artist or spiritual leader. Evidence suggests they also created textile art, though organic materials rarely survive in the archaeological record. Impressions in clay show woven fabrics with complex patterns. Bone needles indicate sophisticated sewing techniques that would have been used for both practical clothing and decorative items. The artistic traditions of the Paleolithic weren't static, they evolved and spread across continents. Similar artistic styles appear in caves separated by thousands of miles, suggesting cultural exchange networks that spanned vast distances. Ideas, techniques, and artistic conventions traveled along with people and trade goods. Much Paleolithic art seems connected to spiritual or ceremonial activities. The deep cave locations, the emphasis on animals, and the presence of abstract symbols suggest these were sacred spaces where rituals were. performed and spiritual knowledge was transmitted. Some caves show evidence of acoustic properties that would have enhanced ceremonial activities. The artists chose locations where sounds would echo or resonate in specific ways. They might have combined visual art with music and storytelling to create immersive, spiritual experiences. The abstract symbols found alongside animal paintings, dots, lines, geometric patterns, might represent early forms of writing or notation systems. Some researchers believe these symbols encode astronomical observations, seasonal calendars, or spiritual concepts that we're only beginning to understand. One of the most intriguing aspects of Paleolithic art is its sudden appearance in the archaeological record. Around 40,000 years ago, there's an explosion of artistic activity that suggests a fundamental change in human consciousness, what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic revolution. This wasn't just the development of new techniques, it was the emergence of symbolic thinking on a scale never seen before. Humans began creating art not just for practical purposes, but for aesthetic, spiritual, and communicative reasons that transcend immediate survival needs. The legacy of these first artists extends far beyond their individual creations. They established the principle that humans are not just tool users or problem solvers, but creators of beauty and meaning. They showed that art is not separate from survival. It's part of what makes survival worthwhile. When we visit museums and see Paleolithic art, we're not just looking at ancient artifacts, we're connecting with the first stirrings of human creativity. These artists, working by torchlight in dangerous caves, established traditions that lead directly to Michelangelo, Mozart, and every artist who has ever tried to capture beauty in permanent form. They remind us that the impulse to create, to express, to leave something beautiful behind, is one of the most fundamental aspects of being human. Imagine a world without words. No names for things, no way to share complex ideas, no stories to pass down through generations. For most of human evolution, this was reality. Our ancestors communicated through gestures, facial expressions, and simple vocalizations, much like other primates do today. Then, sometime between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The human brain developed the capacity for complex language, not just the ability to make sounds, but to combine those sounds into infinite patterns of meaning. It was perhaps the most important development in human history. But how did it happen? Language leaves no fossils, writes no records. We must piece together the story from anatomy, genetics, archaeology, and studies of how children learn language today. The evidence suggests that the development of speech was gradual, then sudden like water slowly heating until it reaches a boiling point. The physical prerequisites for speech evolved slowly over millions of years. Our ancestors' larynx descended in the throat, creating a larger resonating chamber for complex sounds. Their tongues became more flexible and precise. Their brains developed specialized areas for language processing. Modern humans have a unique vocal tract that allows us to produce the full range of speech sounds. Neanderthals had similar anatomy, suggesting they too could speak, though perhaps not with the same precision. Earlier human species lacked these adaptations, limiting them to simpler vocalizations. The first proto-languages were probably gestural combinations of hand signals, facial expressions, and simple sounds. Many linguists believe that spoken language evolved from gesture, as our ancestors began to vocalize while making hand movements, eventually replacing the gestures with pure speech. Asterisk evidence for this comes from modern sign languages, which show the same complexity and structure as spoken languages. They also engage the same brain areas, suggesting that the capacity for language is independent of the specific channel, whether visual or auditory, used for communication. The breakthrough came when early humans developed the ability to combine sounds into meaningful units, what linguists call discrete infinity. Unlike animal communication, which is limited to specific calls for specific situations, human language can create unlimited meanings from a finite set of sounds. This was revolutionary. Instead of having separate calls for danger, food, and mating, humans could combine basic elements to create concepts like dangerous food or food that attracts, dangerous animals. The possibilities became literally infinite. Archaeological evidence suggests that complex language emerged around the same time as behavioral. Modernity, the explosion of art, sophisticated tools, and symbolic thinking that marks the Upper Paleolithic revolution. This is probably not coincidental. Language didn't just allow communication, it enabled abstract thinking. You can't really think about complex concepts without words to organize them. Language provided the mental framework for planning, reasoning, and imagining scenarios that didn't yet exist. With language, Paleolithic peoples could plan complex hunts days or weeks in advance. They could share detailed knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and resource locations. They could coordinate group activities with unprecedented precision. But perhaps most importantly, language allowed the accumulation of cultural knowledge across generations. Instead of each generation having to rediscover everything through trial and error, successful innovations could be preserved and transmitted through speech. An elder could explain not just what to do, but why to do it. A successful hunter could share not just techniques, but the reasoning behind them. A healer could pass on not just remedies, but understanding of how they worked. Knowledge became cumulative. Language also enabled the development of social rules and moral systems. Concepts like fairness, obligation, and justice require abstract thinking that's only possible with complex language. Paleolithic societies could develop sophisticated social norms and enforce them through discussion and persuasion. The development of language had profound effects on human relationships. It allowed for gossip, which might seem trivial, but actually serves important social functions. Gossip helps maintain group cohesion, enforces social norms, and allows people to track the reputations and relationships of others in their community. Language also enabled deception in ways that were previously impossible. Animals can mislead each other through false signals, but humans could create elaborate fictional scenarios. This created an evolutionary arms race between the ability to deceive and the ability to detect deception. Perhaps most remarkably, language allowed humans to talk about things that didn't exist, fictional scenarios, mythical beings, abstract concepts. This capacity for fiction was crucial for developing religion, art, and complex social institutions. Stories became vehicles for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. A myth about a great flood might encode information about seasonal weather patterns. A legend about a heroic hunt might preserve hunting techniques. Religious stories might reinforce social values and moral behavior. Paleolithic languages were probably very different from modern ones. They likely had smaller vocabularies, but more complex grammatical structures for encoding precise information about spatial relationships, kinship, and natural phenomena. They might have used sound symbolism more extensively, where the sound of a word relates to its meaning. Some linguists believe that early languages were more iconic, where words sounded like what they described. Over time, languages became more arbitrary, but traces of sound symbolism remain in all modern languages. Words for small things tend to use high-pitched sounds, while words for large things use low-pitched sounds. As human populations spread across the globe, languages diversified rapidly. Isolated groups developed distinct vocabularies, grammars, and sound systems. By the end of the Paleolithic, there were probably thousands of different languages, each adapted to its specific environment and culture. This linguistic diversity was a source of strength. Different languages encoded different ways of thinking about the world. Some might have been better for describing spatial relationships, others for temporal sequences, still others for social relationships. But linguistic diversity also created barriers. When different groups met, they needed ways to communicate across language boundaries. This led to the development of trade languages, gesture systems, and eventually the first attempts at translation and interpretation. Development of language transformed humanity from just another primate species into something. Unprecedented beings capable of sharing complex thoughts, preserving knowledge across generations, and creating shared fictional realities that could unite large groups of people. Language made possible everything we consider uniquely human art: religion, science, literature, law, and philosophy. It's the foundation of all human culture and the key to our species' extraordinary success. And it all began in the caves and campsites of our Paleolithic ancestors, when the first human looked at another and found a way to share what was in their mind. In a workshop area outside a Paleolithic cave, an expert napper sits cross-legged, surrounded by stone flakes and half-finished tools. With movements precise as a surgeon's, they strike a piece of flint with a bone hammer, sending razor-sharp flakes flying. Each strike is calculated, each angle deliberate. They're not just making tools, they're practicing humanity's first technology. Tool-making is what separates humans from almost all other animals. While some species use simple tools, only humans create tools to make other tools, plan tool-making sequences days in advance, and pass complex technological knowledge through generations. The story begins 2.6 million years ago, with the first crude stone choppers made by our distant ancestors. These Oldowan tools were simple but revolutionary sharp edges created by striking one stone against another. They allowed early humans to process meat more efficiently, crack bones for marrow, and dig for roots. But it was Homo erectus, around 1.8 million years ago, who created the first standardized tool, the hand axe. These teardrop-shaped implements were made to consistent patterns across Africa, Asia, and Europe. They represent humanity's first global technology, unchanged for over 1 million years. Think about that, 1 million years of technological stability. The hand axe was so perfectly adapted to human needs that it required no improvement for longer than our entire species has existed. It was knife, scraper, digging tool, and weapon all in one elegant design. The real revolution came with modern humans and Neanderthals, who developed sophisticated stone technologies that required years of training to master. The level Wu technique, developed around 300,000 years ago, involved carefully preparing a stone core to produce predetermined flake shapes. This wasn't random chipping, it was three-dimensional engineering. The napper had to visualize the final product, plan the sequence of strikes, and execute with perfect precision. A single mistake could ruin hours of work. Master nappers were highly valued specialists, whose skills were essential for group survival. Paleolithic toolkits were incredibly diverse. Scrapers for processing hides, burins for carving bone and antler, points for spears and arrows, needles for sewing, awls for piercing, and dozens of specialized implements for specific tasks. Each tool type required different techniques and materials. The finest Paleolithic blades were thinner than paper and sharper than surgical steel. Obsidian tools could achieve edges only a few molecules wide, sharper than anything we can make today, except with laser technology. These weren't crude implements, but precision instruments that would impress modern craftspeople. But stone was just one component of Paleolithic technology. The real innovation was composite tools, combining stone, bone, antler, and wood into complex implements. A spear might have a stone point, wooden shaft, and sinew binding, each component optimized for its specific function. These composite tools required sophisticated understanding of material properties. Craftspeople knew that yew wood was best for bow staves, because of its combination of strength and flexibility. They knew that sinew made the strongest bindings when properly prepared. They understood how different materials would behave under stress. The atlatla, or spear thrower, was perhaps the most ingenious Paleolithic invention. This simple device, essentially a lever that extended the throwing arm, could increase spear velocity by 50% and accuracy by even more. It was the difference between wounding a mammoth and killing it cleanly. The physics behind the atlatla are sophisticated. It works by increasing the effective length of the thrower's arm, creating greater angular velocity at the point of release. Paleolithic peoples understood these principles intuitively, creating tools that modern engineers recognize as mechanically optimal. Paleolithic hunting technology was incredibly diverse and specialized. They created different spear points for different prey, broad points for large game, narrow points for fish, barbed points that would stick in wounded animals. They developed bolas for bringing down running prey, and pit traps for capturing entire herds. The bow and arrow, invented around 20,000 years ago, represented another technological leap. It required understanding of energy storage and release, precise crafting of multiple components, and extensive practice to master. A skilled archer could kill silently from a distance, revolutionizing hunting strategies. But tools weren't just for hunting. Paleolithic peoples developed sophisticated domestic technologies. They created containers from bark, hide, and woven fibers. They made cordage from plant fibers and animal sinew. They developed techniques for preserving meat through smoking, drying, and freezing. Their fire-making technology was particularly impressive. They could start fires in any weather using friction methods, flint and steel, or even fire pistons that used compression to ignite tinder. They understood how to select the right materials, prepare tinder, and nurse sparks into flames even in wet conditions. Fire wasn't just for warmth and cooking. It was a tool for landscape management. Paleolithic peoples used controlled burns to encourage the growth of useful plants, drive game animals, and clear travel routes. They were ecosystem engineers, actively managing their environment. They also developed sophisticated shelter technologies. Arctic peoples built snow houses that were warmer inside than outside, even in -40 degrees Fahrenheit weather. They created portable shelters that could be assembled quickly during migrations. They knew how to select cave sites that provided protection from wind and predators. The mammoth bone houses of Eastern Europe were marvels of engineering. These structures used interlocking mammoth bones as a framework, covered with hides and insulated with vegetation. They could house 20 people comfortably and withstand Arctic storms that would destroy modern tents. These weren't random piles of bones. They were carefully engineered structures. The builders understood load distribution, thermodynamics, and structural stability. They created foundations, drainage systems, and ventilation that would be recognizable to modern architects. Textile technology was equally sophisticated, though organic materials rarely survive in the archaeological record. Impressions in clay show that Paleolithic peoples could create complex woven fabrics. They had looms, spindles, and techniques for creating waterproof and insulating materials. They developed techniques for processing plant fibers into strong cordage and fabric. They knew how to ret flax, spin fibers, and weave complex patterns. Their clothing wasn't just functional. It was often decorated with intricate designs that showed artistic skill and cultural identity. Medical technology was another crucial area of innovation. Paleolithic peoples developed sophisticated pharmacologies based on plant medicines. They knew which plants could reduce pain, fight infection, or induce specific physiological effects. They performed successful surgeries, including trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure. Archaeological evidence shows healed fractures that were properly set, infections that were successfully treated, and even evidence of prosthetic devices. These weren't just lucky accidents, they represent systematic, Medical knowledge passed down through generations. Transportation. Technology allowed Paleolithic peoples to colonize the entire planet. They built boats capable of crossing 60 miles of open ocean to reach Australia. They developed sleds and travois for moving heavy loads across snow and rough terrain. They created snowshoes and ice cleats for winter travel. Their navigation. Technology was purely mental, but incredibly sophisticated. They could navigate by stars, wind patterns, wave formations, and subtle environmental cues. They created mental maps that covered thousands of square miles and could find their way in conditions that would challenge modern GPS systems. Perhaps most importantly, Paleolithic peoples developed technologies for preserving and transmitting knowledge. They created notation systems, mnemonic devices, and teaching methods that ensured crucial information survived across generations. Their oral traditions were living libraries of technical knowledge. What's most remarkable about Paleolithic technology is its sustainability. These tools and techniques were used for tens of thousands of years without depleting resources or damaging ecosystems. They represent a perfect balance between human needs and environmental limits. Modern people often think of Stone Age technology as primitive, but this misses the point entirely. Paleolithic tools were perfectly adapted to their purpose and environment. They were sustainable, repairable, and made from renewable materials. In many ways, they were superior to modern alternatives. A Paleolithic hunter could make a complete toolkit from materials found in nature, using techniques learned over a lifetime of practice. A modern person, stripped of industrial technology, would struggle to create even the simplest stone tool. Who is really more technologically sophisticated? The technologies developed by our Paleolithic ancestors weren't just survival tools. They were the foundation of all human civilization. Every modern technology, from computers to spacecraft, traces its lineage back to that first stone tool made 2.6 million years ago. They remind us that true technology isn't about complexity. It's about solving human problems with intelligence, creativity, and respect for the natural world. Deep in a cave in the Pyrenees, archaeologists discovered something that sent chills down their spines. A 15,000-year-old chamber filled with clay sculptures of bison, bears, and human figures. But these weren't just art pieces. The floor was covered with the footprints of children, preserved in the clay for millennia. This was a sacred space where Paleolithic peoples came to perform rituals. We can barely imagine. Religion. The search for meaning beyond the material world may be humanity's oldest intellectual pursuit. Long before agriculture, cities, or writing, our ancestors were grappling with the fundamental questions that still haunt us today. Why do we exist? What happens when we die? Is there purpose to suffering? The earliest evidence of religious thinking comes from Neanderthal, burial sites dating back 100,000 years. These weren't simple disposals of bodies. They were careful ceremonies that suggest belief in an afterlife. Bodies were positioned in specific ways, often curled like sleeping children, facing east toward the rising sun. The famous Shanadar cave burials in Iraq show Neanderthals burying their dead with flowers, hyacinths, bachelor's buttons, and other blooms that had no practical purpose except to honor the deceased. This 60,000-year-old gesture reveals minds capable of abstract thought about death, beauty, and transcendence. But it was modern humans who developed religion into a complex system of beliefs, rituals, and social institutions. The archaeological record shows an explosion of religious activity beginning around 40,000 years ago, the same time as the development of art, music, and sophisticated technology. Paleolithic religion was likely animistic, seeing spirits in animals, plants, rocks, and natural phenomena. Every aspect of the natural world was alive with spiritual force. The wind carried messages from the ancestors. The movements of animals revealed the will of the spirits. Dreams were journeys to other worlds. This wasn't primitive superstition. It was a sophisticated worldview that recognized the interconnectedness of all life. Paleolithic peoples understood that their survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual forces that controlled the natural world. The central figures in Paleolithic religion were shamans, individuals who could communicate with the spirit world through trance, dreams, and ritual. These weren't just religious leaders, but doctors, psychologists, and advisors who helped their communities navigate both physical and spiritual challenges. Shamans underwent rigorous training that often began in childhood. They learned to enter altered states of consciousness through fasting, dancing, drumming, and sometimes psychoactive plants. In these trance states, they could journey to other worlds, communicate with spirits, and return with knowledge and healing power. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira weren't just art, they were shamanic visions made permanent. Many show animals in impossible combinations or supernatural contexts that suggest they were painted by shamans recording their spiritual journeys. Some cave paintings show human figures with animal heads, shamans in the process of transformation, taking on the spiritual power of their animal guides. Others show geometric patterns that match the visual hallucinations reported by modern shamans in altered states of consciousness. Paleolithic religious ceremonies were likely elaborate affairs involving entire communities. They might last for days, combining music, dance, storytelling, and ritual to create powerful shared experiences that bonded groups together and reinforced cultural values. These weren't just social gatherings, they were essential survival tools. In a world where cooperation meant the difference between life and death, religious ceremonies created the social cohesion necessary for group survival. They established hierarchies, resolved conflicts, and maintained cultural traditions. Shamanic healing combined practical medicine with spiritual intervention. Shamans knew which plants could treat specific ailments, but they also understood that healing required addressing spiritual as well as physical causes of illness. They were the first psychotherapists, treating trauma, depression, and social conflicts. Archaeological evidence shows that Paleolithic peoples cared for disabled and elderly members of their communities, individuals who couldn't contribute to hunting or gathering but were kept alive and supported. This suggests religious beliefs about the sacred value of all human life. Ancestor worship was probably central to Paleolithic religion. The dead weren't gone. They became powerful spirits who could help or harm the living. Proper burial rituals ensured that ancestors would be benevolent protectors rather than dangerous ghosts. Grave goods, tools, ornaments, and food buried with the dead weren't just gifts for the afterlife. They were insurance policies, ensuring that the deceased would have everything they needed in the spirit world and wouldn't return to trouble the living. Paleolithic religion was closely tied to natural cycles. The phases of the moon, the changing seasons, and the movements of animals all had spiritual significance. Ceremonies marked important transitions: the first hunt of a young man, the first menstruation of a young woman, the death of an elder. These rituals weren't just symbolic, they were practical ways of organizing social life around natural rhythms. They ensured that important activities happened at optimal times and that knowledge about seasonal patterns was preserved and transmitted. Paleolithic peoples developed creation myths that explained how the world came to be and humanity's place in it. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were philosophical systems that provided meaning and guidance for daily life. Many of these myths involved animals as creators or teachers. The raven who brought fire, the spider who taught weaving, the wolf who showed humans how to hunt cooperatively. These stories encoded practical knowledge while also expressing spiritual relationships with the natural world. Religious beliefs created complex systems of taboos and restrictions that regulated behavior. Certain animals might be forbidden as food except during specific ceremonies. Certain places might be sacred and off-limits to all but shamans. These rules helped manage resources and maintain social order. What modern people might see as arbitrary superstitions were often sophisticated conservation practices. Religious taboos against hunting pregnant animals or harvesting plants during certain seasons helped ensure sustainable resource use. Paleolithic religion also provided frameworks for personal transformation. Initiation ceremonies marked the transition from childhood to adulthood, involving ordeals that tested courage, endurance, and spiritual commitment. These weren't just coming-of-age parties, they were profound spiritual experiences that shaped individual identity. Modern psychology recognizes that these initiation rituals served important psychological functions. They helped young people develop adult identities, cope with life's challenges, and find their place in the community. They were sophisticated therapeutic interventions. Disguised as religious ceremonies, religious experiences in the Paleolithic were often ecstatic, involving altered states of consciousness that provided direct contact with the divine. These weren't just emotional highs, but profound spiritual experiences that could transform individuals and communities. The capacity for religious experience may be hardwired into the human brain. Neurological studies show that spiritual practices activate specific brain regions associated with transcendence, unity, and meaning. Our Paleolithic ancestors were exploring the same neural pathways that mystics use today. Paleolithic religion wasn't a primitive precursor to real religion. It was a sophisticated system of beliefs and practices that address the fundamental human need for meaning, community, and transcendence. It provided our ancestors with the psychological and social tools they needed to survive in a harsh and uncertain world. And in doing so, it laid the foundation for every religious tradition that would follow. From the great world religions to the personal spirituality that millions of people practice today. 15,000 years ago, the world began to warm. The massive ice sheets that had covered a third of the planet for 100,000 years started their slow retreat. Sea levels rose, flooding vast coastal plains. Forests replaced tundra, and the megafauna that had sustained human civilization for millennia began to disappear forever. This wasn't just climate change, it was the end of the world as humans had known it. The Pleistocene epoch, which had shaped human evolution for 2.6 million years, was coming to an end. The Holocene, our current geological period, was beginning, and humanity would need to adapt or face extinction. The warming happened gradually at first, then accelerated rapidly. Within a few thousand years, global temperatures rose by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Glaciers that had been stable for millennia collapsed into the sea. Weather patterns that had been predictable for generations became chaotic and unpredictable. For Paleolithic peoples, this was catastrophic. Their entire way of life was based on intimate knowledge of stable environments. They knew where animals migrated, when plants fruited, where water could be found. Suddenly, all of this knowledge became obsolete. The megafauna began to vanish. Woolly mammoths, which had survived multiple ice ages, couldn't adapt to the rapidly changing climate. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears one by one. The giants of the Pleistocene went extinct. Some scientists blame human hunting for these extinctions, but the evidence suggests a more complex story. Climate change destroyed the ecosystems these animals depended on. Humans may have delivered the final blow to already stressed populations, but they weren't the primary cause. For human societies that had based their entire culture around hunting these giant animals, the extinctions were devastating. Imagine if all the large animals in your environment suddenly disappeared. Your food sources, your raw materials, your spiritual symbols all gone. But humans did what they had always done. They adapted. As large game became scarce, They turned to smaller animals, fish, and marine resources. They developed new hunting techniques for deer, rabbits, and birds. They learned to exploit coastal resources like shellfish and seaweed. This transition required remarkable flexibility. Hunting mammoth with spears was very different from catching fish with nets or gathering shellfish on beaches. New tools, new techniques, new social organizations. Everything had to be reinvented. The archaeological record shows an explosion of innovation during this period. Bow and arrow technology became widespread. Fishing gear became more sophisticated. People developed new types of tools for processing smaller game and plant foods. But the most important innovation was still to come. As wild food sources became less reliable, some human groups began experimenting with a radical new survival strategy, controlling their food supply instead of just hunting and gathering it. Agriculture didn't happen overnight. It began with small steps, protecting useful wild plants, weeding out competitors, saving seeds from the best specimens. Over thousands of years, these practices gradually transformed wild plants into domestic crops. The first crops were developed in the Middle East around 11,000 years ago: wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. Similar developments occurred independently in China: rice and millet. Mexico, corn and beans. Peru, potatoes and quinoa. And other regions around the world. This wasn't just a new way of getting food. It was a complete transformation of human society. Agriculture required people to stay in one place, to plan for the future, to accumulate surplus food. It led to permanent settlements, population growth, and social stratification. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was the most important change in human history since the development of language. It made possible everything we associate with civilization: cities, writing, complex technology, specialized occupations, organized religion, and political states. But agriculture also brought new problems. Farmers were more vulnerable to crop failures than hunter-gatherers were to temporary food shortages. Permanent settlements led to the accumulation of waste and the spread of diseases. Population growth put pressure on resources and led to conflicts over land. Archaeological evidence suggests that early farmers were actually less healthy than hunter-gatherers. They were shorter, had more dental problems, and showed signs of nutritional deficiencies. Agriculture provided more calories, but less nutritional diversity. Agriculture also led to social inequality on a scale never seen before. When food could be stored and accumulated, some people could control more resources than others. The egalitarian societies of the Paleolithic gave way to hierarchical civilizations with rulers, priests, and slaves. Yet despite these costs, agriculture spread rapidly around the world. Within a few thousand years, most human societies had adopted farming. The advantages: larger populations, more reliable food supplies. The ability to support specialists outweighed the disadvantages. The few remaining hunter-gatherer societies were gradually pushed into marginal environments: deserts, Arctic regions, dense forests where agriculture wasn't practical. The Paleolithic way of life, which had sustained humanity for 95% of our history, became a relic of the past. By 5,000 years ago, most humans lived in agricultural societies. The intimate knowledge of wild environments, the egalitarian social structures, the sustainable relationships with nature that had characterized the Paleolithic were largely forgotten. Today, less than 1% of humans live as hunter-gatherers. The few remaining groups, the San of Southern Africa, the Inuit of the Arctic, the Aborigines of Australia, are living museums of our ancient past, preserving knowledge and ways of life that stretch back to the dawn of humanity. But the legacy of the Paleolithic lives on in all of us. Our brains evolved for life in small groups, not mass societies. Our emotions were shaped by the need to cooperate in hunting bands, not compete in market economies. Our spiritual needs were formed by direct contact with nature, not urban environments. Many of the problems of modern life, depression, anxiety, obesity, social isolation, can be traced to the mismatch between our Paleolithic psychology and our modern environment. We are Stone Age minds trying to cope with Space Age realities, yet the Paleolithic also offers solutions. The emphasis on community cooperation, the sustainable use of resources, the integration of spiritual and practical life. These ancient wisdom traditions are more relevant than ever in our modern world. The story of our Paleolithic ancestors isn't just ancient history, it's a guide to understanding who we are and who we might become. They faced challenges as great as any we face today and found ways not just to survive, but to create meaning, beauty, and community in the harshest conditions imaginable. Their legacy lives on in our DNA, our dreams, and our deepest human needs for connection, purpose, and transcendence. As we reach the end of our journey through the Paleolithic world, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned about our ancestors and about ourselves. For 200,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, developing the physical, mental, and social capacities that still define us today. When you feel the urge to explore new places, you're hearing the echo of ancestors who colonized the entire planet. When you gather with friends around a fire, you're recreating the social bonds that kept Paleolithic bands alive. When you're moved by art or music, you're experiencing the same aesthetic emotions that drove cave painters to create masterpieces by torchlight. The Paleolithic wasn't a primitive prelude to real human history. It was the formative period when everything we consider essentially human was developed. Language, art, religion, technology, social cooperation, moral reasoning, all of these emerged during the long millennia when our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers. Modern humans often think of themselves as having transcended nature, but the Paleolithic reminds us that we are nature. Our bodies evolved for walking long distances, not sitting at desks. Our minds developed for solving survival problems in small groups, not managing complex bureaucracies. Our emotions were shaped by the need for intimate social bonds, not anonymous urban interactions. Perhaps most importantly, the Paleolithic shows us that humans can live sustainably on Earth. For 95% of our history, we took only what we needed and left ecosystems intact for future generations. The environmental crisis of the modern world isn't inevitable. It's a recent aberration from the human norm. The Paleolithic also demonstrates the power of human adaptability. Our ancestors survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and mass extinctions. They colonized every continent except Antarctica and thrived in environments from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. Whatever challenges we face in the future, we have the genetic and cultural heritage to overcome them. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Paleolithic is about what makes life meaningful. Our ancestors didn't have material wealth, technological convenience, or protection from natural dangers. Yet they created rich cultures filled with art, music, spirituality, and deep human connections. They remind us that meaning doesn't come from what we have, but from how we relate to each other and to the world around us. The cave painters of Lascaux, working by flickering torchlight in dangerous underground chambers, were creating something more valuable than any material possession. They were making beauty that would outlast empires. Today, as we face challenges that would have been familiar to our Paleolithic ancestors, climate change, resource scarcity, social conflict, we can learn from their solutions. They survived through cooperation, not competition. They thrived through adaptation, not resistance to change. They found meaning through connection to something larger than themselves. The story of our Paleolithic ancestors, ultimately a story of hope. They faced impossible odds and not only survived, but created the foundation of everything we call human civilization. They remind us that no challenge is insurmountable if we work together, think creatively, and remember what truly matters as you go about your modern life, driving to work, shopping in supermarkets, communicating through digital devices. Remember that you carry within you the wisdom of 200,000 years of human experience. You are the descendant of people who painted masterpieces in caves, who crossed oceans in primitive boats, who survived ice ages with nothing but their intelligence and cooperation. Their blood flows in your veins. Their dreams live in your DNA. Their courage echoes in your heart. You are not just a modern person, you are the latest chapter in the greatest survival story ever told, and that story is far from over.